Hello, I'm Pastor David Lystra. Some time ago, I asked a retired pastor in our community of faith, the Reverend Ken Boettcher, to sit down with me and talk about something that he could speak to uniquely, at least in my experience of people I know. He was the one person I could talk to about this particular subject. It goes back to when the Evangelical United Brethren, as a denomination, merged together with what was then the Methodist Church and formed what we now call the United Methodist Church. Now, this took place back in 1968. The first discipline, which means our book of polity on how the church operates, was put out in 1972. But in 1968, in order to make that happen, there had to be a vote to do so in a general conference setting where the two conferences came together, the two churches, and then it had to be affirmed. And Ken, young Ken at the time, voted against it. Now, he had his reasons for doing so, and I was curious about that. And in the midst of where we are right now with our United Methodist Church, considering, how we go about this what is truly a schism, principally over our understanding of Scripture. I felt it was important to know how we came together. What sort of issues, and why would someone have had an issue with the original unity that took place back then? So he came in and he told us about that. And he told us about some other things and some history about the church, and really gave me, and I hope that you'll watch this and will give you a firsthand look on how that came about. So I hope that you'll watch this and listen and see from his eyes that unity that took place and why there was some angst around that at the time. Even as now we talk about disunity, I think it's an important time to see what it is that we're unified by. And I think you'll hear that in what Ken has to say. He'll talk about these things. And I found it an extremely valuable conversation. I hope you will too.
All right. Well, Ken, it's really good to have you here. You're well aware of all the troubles the United Methodist Church is going through right now. We've been debating this issue of what it means to be a unified church now. It seems to me for 50 years, but I haven't been around that long. But currently, a lot of people are really interested in how the church came together, and was it a smooth sailing at that time, or was there any disagreement or uncertainties? And I've had conversations with you where you talk about that time, and maybe weren't as ready and as gung-ho as others were to pull this together back in 1968. So first, if you don't mind just saying a few things about yourself, maybe some of your history.
Okay, thank you, David. I'm Ken Boettcher, and I was active pastor 38 years in Wisconsin Conference, and I just got my certificate for 60 years being a member of the conference, and since I was licensed to preach. So I have a little history behind me, and so look at me, you're looking at history. And while I'm not a historian, I've done a lot of research in family things and church things also, and these books here, I have books that I've read and have enjoyed about history of the especially the Evangelical United Brethren side of the church, which is what I am from. That doesn't mean much to people today, because was 52 years ago, 54 years ago, we merged into the United Methodist Church. And so there are very few people, pastors, who are either Methodist or EUB still hanging around, and I happen to be one of them. So what's interesting about, I think, what's going on today, it's not new. But it's different in the light of the fact that most of the things we talk about, unions and all in the church, have been unions, and now we're talking about a split in the church.
Mhm.
Now, that's not rare either, but anyway, what we're thinking about today is different from what's been happening over the years. And maybe just a little bit of my history. And, you know, I was born into a church that was the evangelical church. Just evangelical church was its name. And that was a result of the union of the Old German Evangelical Association and the United Evangelical Church, which were one church. Well, they were the evangelical church to start with, then there was a split. The association was carried the main flavor of the church, and the United Evangelical Church became the offshoot.
Okay.
Well, that lasted for about 30 years, and they were united. All came back together again. So it's like one took a detour, one stayed on the highway, and the detour came back to the highway, so they got back together for, I'm sure, very practical reasons. And there are a number of places in the history of the church where churches have temporarily separated, but then they all came back together and said, well, the separation didn't work, so we got to get back together again.
And that's when they formed the EUB.
Not quite.
Not yet. Okay.
We got one more stop.
Okay.
So what's interesting, I was born and baptized as an evangelical.
Yeah.
And that's back in 1939 when I was born. In 1946, the evangelical church was a German-based church, started in Pennsylvania, and there was a United Brethren Church, United Brethren in Christ, which was also a German church started by a German Reformed pastor, Philip William Otterbein, who came from Germany to the U.S. and began the first church. And what's neat about it is in Baltimore, Maryland, the first United Brethren Church stands right downtown, right near the ballpark where the Orioles play, and I've had a chance to visit it. Beautiful structure, it's still there. Over 200 years it's been standing there. It is a landmark in downtown Baltimore.
Mhm.
Anyway, so the evangelical people and the United Brethren people kind of found each other. And they lived parallel lives for a long time. And finally, in 1946, they made the big move. They got together. And so they formed a denomination in the United States that had about 800,000 people together, which was not large compared to the Methodist Church, but was pretty substantial in regard to a lot of the smaller European country-based churches that spoke common languages. Mm-hmm. And that's what brought the two together, they had a common language. Okay. But the interesting thing is that they all based their structure and their theology on John Wesley's stuff. They borrowed his English stuff and made it German and made it work for them. So, in 1946, I became an evangelical United Brethren youth in a church. And that's 46. For 22 years, we were EUBs. I went to college and seminary in an Evangelical United Brethren environment and was ordained in the Evangelical United Brethren Church by Bishop Heiniger in 1965 and came to Door County, Wisconsin, was appointed to the Northern Door County churches. And I had two Evangelical United Brethren churches. And what's interesting is the third church on my circuit was an independent church. It used to be a Baptist church. It's now the Fish Creek Community Church. It was then too.
Okay.
And so that worked out well. It was helpful for the conference to have the three churches helping to support the pastor. In fact, even that was not enough money to pay my salary. The conference mission board paid about a third of my salary.
Okay.
So that's what's going on in small churches. Anyway, so and now we're talking union from it's been going on, what's going on forever through the 50s and the early 60s. Very popular talk about church union. I know it was a big debate when I was in seminary. The seminary was split the students as to whether we should unite. The EUB should unite with the Methodists. Mm-hmm. But it came about, and in fact, the the motion to merge as a denomination was made by Ken Krieger, who was the author of a book I didn't bring. The history of the evangelical church.
Okay,
Anyway, he made the motion, and his father was my pastor for a while.
really?
And at the annual conference in Michigan, he made the motion that the churches should come together in union.
Mhm.
I think it was probably, that was all probably planned because he was an EUB and they needed to initiate it so that we didn't feel like we're being swallowed up by the Methodists. So if an EUB pastor said, yeah, we need to merge, I think that helped to cover some of the issues amongst EUB people. So, in fact, I was at the general conference where this happened in Michigan. I was in seminary at that point, and so we took a trip over there to go to general conference from Chicago.
Okay.
And was there and heard him make this motion, stood up on the floor and made the motion. So that took place in the annual conference of like 1962 or whatever. That took some years for all the annual conferences had to vote on it.
To affirm.
Yeah, maybe it was in 64. I'm not sure. It was somewhere, probably 64. Anyway, so it came to a vote at the annual conference level in Wisconsin, and I remember it was in Milwaukee. And I was the pastor then here in Door County and was down there, and we took the vote to decide whether we wanted to unite with the Methodist Church. And it was almost unanimous. Only one person dissented. That was me.
Yeah.
And not so much because I really didn't understand. Probably nobody understood exactly what all of the complexities would be, but the whole principle of it was, I came from a church that was very conservative. We did nothing with the Methodists when I was a youth. We were a part of a mix of more conservative type churches. And so this really wasn't where I was at. And so I just stood up alone and said, guys, I'm opposed.
Okay.
It was overwhelming though, of course, 200 to 1 or whatever. So it worked, and was no big deal. And some people congratulate me for being brave enough to stand up and speak against it, because probably others might have, but they weren't brave enough, see? So I did it. Anyway, so the union took place, and was in 1968, we had the ceremonies to acknowledge the church union, and there's a picture in our church hallway of me along with the local Methodist pastor here and our 2 lay leaders. I had a service we had in Sturgeon Bay to bring the churches together. So then we became United Methodist, and indeed, looking back, it worked out very well. It was a very practical thing to do. And we were not really diverse in theology much. Probably the single largest issue in that union was the tenure of bishops. In the Evangelical United Brethren Church, every 4 years at the annual general conference, we elected our bishops. And they only could go for 8 years, like the President of the United States. There's a limit. And if they weren't retirement age, they went back to a local church. Now the Methodists were making their bishops forever.
I like that.
And that was one of the big issues. How we're going to handle that.
Big issue today, by the way.
It is.
Yeah, it is.
Okay. See, it doesn't go away.
No.
And I'm sure there were some minor issues. There wasn't much difference. Because really, the Evangelical United Brethren Church was a Wesleyan church, only it was German. And Wesley's people were English. And so that was the major difference. And we got over that hurdle, of course, that it allowed us to come together. And we were all speaking English these days, back in the 50s and 60s. So language was no longer the barrier. And so it's interesting. I have an interesting document at home. I'm doing work on my genealogy, and I came up with an original certificate of my great-grandfather, who helped found my home church there in the town of Grover back in Marin County. And he was a delegate to the annual conference one year back in the 1800s. It was at Marquezan. And I got this document. It's kind of neat to see this. It was all dated. His name was on it and this kind of stuff. And back in that day, Marquezan was probably 100 miles from where he lived, or 120 miles. how they all managed to get together in horse and buggies, you know,
Sure.
and come together in a church halfway across the state.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I think about that once in a while, but he was apparently a dedicated guy and was a part of the church and it was German.
Mhm.
I couldn't read the document because it was German. I mean, I made out generally what it said, but the detail of it was not there. But anyway, he had a certificate for being a part of that annual conference that year.
Mhm.
So that's my heritage, and I guess that's maybe why I wasn't so sure I wanted to let the church go that already yet in 1968. But anyway, so things have worked out well. And I have some books here, and I've done some work and studies on the church history, you know, the history of our denominations. In fact, one fun thing happened to me when I was in seminary. Dr. Eller, who is the author of this book, These Evangelical United Brethren,
Okay.
and I think he's half author of this along with Bruce Bainey.
Okay.
He was a big historian, research guy, and I had a class with him on church history, and so we had to do a paper on something, and so I spent my time in the library going through some old general conference catalogs, or what we call them, the record of the general conference journals.
Journal stuff.
And I found that back in like 1912 and 12 and 1916, I think it was, there was some bickering going on in the church, and people were dissenting on certain issues and stuff. And I forgot already that 60 years ago.
Yeah.
When I was in seminary.
Yeah.
Or 50 some years ago. Anyway, I did a paper on this dissension and followed through a couple of journals, you know, and all the people, what they're arguing. And it was some social issue.
Mhm.
And so I turned it in and he gave me an A. And then he said, "Can I keep it?" So I said, "Sure, you got it."
Yep.
I don't need it anymore.
Yeah.
So he enjoyed it because, you know, it was one of the many little issues that he had never gotten into, but I picked it up and wrote it up in my paper. And so I helped contribute a little bit to Dr. Eller's understanding of church history.
Oh, wow.
That's kind of fun.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, you know, it's interesting how churches have come together. We all kind of know this, but I guess one thing we need to, I have in my paper, I had some notes, but I'm not reading them because that's better if I just talk. But, you know, we've been, okay, the United Methodist Church is 54 years old. And we think, okay, there's a possibility of the church being divided in different kinds of ways. If you look through all these history books, I don't think you'll find another time in the church history where we have been together for 54 years without breaking up.
Okay.
It's a difficult marriage being a church.
It is.
And so divorces happen. And so we have probably set a record, I believe, as a United Methodist Church of being together this long without any splits occurring during that period of time.
That's interesting.
And I think what is interesting is that I don't know the issues in the split. I mean, I know over the surface issues, okay, what's going on. I tend to, from my understanding, it's not spiritual issues that are the issue, it's all social issues. It's always been social issues. Read these books, I mean, it's been like, back in my home church, if they knew you smoked, you could not belong to our church.
Play cards.
Or if you used alcohol, that was verboten. No, you can't do that.
Yeah.
And so if someone wanted to join a church, I had a little meeting and say, well, what do we know about this guy or person? And those are the issues. So it's kind of crazy how we formed our churches and how we stay together and what our big issues were. It was all those classic sin issues that we had back in the old days that I grew up with. I respect all of that. It was a good foundation to grow up in, but I don't really follow most of those any longer because they're not practical.
Yeah.
And they don't really determine your spirituality.
No, not that.
You know, they're issues, but they're not the center spiritual issues of life. And so we can't really make those central. And that's kind of happened. You know, conservative churches, they were more concerned about how you acted than who you were and what you really believed.
Okay.
And so I think, you know, we're coming back to a little bit of that now, because I think spiritually we're probably not really divided, but it's the the outer shell issues that are really the issue. And we're probably splitting over things that aren't really that important, but to some people they're important. And so anyway, but you know, the train, I have a little diagram here, and you won't be able to see it on camera, but done by Bill Blake, and he put together for the Wisconsin conference the river, shall we say, with all of its side channels and its little creeks and streams that came together. And just reading down this list, I looked at this and this is interesting. Our conference today, our United Methodist Church in Wisconsin, is consisting once of the Norwegian Danish Methodist Episcopal Church, the Northern Swedish Methodist Episcopal Church, the Central Swedish Methodist Episcopal Church, the Norwegian Danish ME Methodist Episcopal, the Chicago German Ave, the Northwest German ME Church, the Northern Swedish, the Central Swedish, all these little denominations that were formed way back, and they all kind of like a river accumulated. All the little streams have come together, and so there's probably 15 or more, including the Fox River Mission Conference of the United Brethren Church, Wisconsin United Brethren, the Wisconsin Evangelical Church, which I have talked about already.
Right.
All of them came together to form the United Methodist Church in 1968. And so we have tons of little rivers that have come together to form the church, which is interesting. I don't think we'll go back to being that many, but sometimes I guess the highway split or river split, so you get to a point where you go your own way. So anyways, I guess my thoughts about the splits, and I'm not into it, I think, like you are, because you're closer to it. You're active, and I'm retired. I can kind of just take a nap and ignore it. As long as my pension money comes in.
That's important.
That's important. But because the church has been many churches at some point in time, to have it kind of go back to a few more than what it is, I mean, the splits, some side channels, as it were, side roads, I don't find terribly threatening, because I think probably down the road 10 or 20 years, some of these split churches might wander back into the mainstream again, as they find that life is not easy out there. You know, you got a lot of issues to deal with, and a lot of just human complexities that have to be dealt with. I know if you're going to be a different church than where we are now, you know, we have all the pension insurance issues and all of these kinds of things that go into organizations that if you have to reorganize, it's not easy. No. And I think that's one of the things I read I was just reviewing last night some of these books, and it was a church that happened way back that they found, because of insuring their buildings, all this stuff, they couldn't split. They had to stay with the big body who had the big insurance policy.
That's part of it, isn't it?
You wake up and say, "Uh-oh, where are we now?"
Yeah.
You know? And I was reading that, and I thought it was very interesting. And so, but you know, the church has endured a lot of difficulty through the years. To go back way to Martin Luther and the Reform. You know, there was a split, worked out, and you know, he formed a lot of little channels and come back together again. And Protestants and Catholics didn't talk together very well for a long time, so probably the 50s or 60s, and now we're getting kind of friendly. We probably would never get together theologically, but at least we can talk to each other and be friends, and not make our differences big differences. And anyway, we can live together, and that's kind of what it's all about, I guess. And I'm not sure where we want to go from here, but you have any other thoughts or questions?
Well, it's interesting. Sometimes we get along better with other denominations than we do with each other in our own denomination. But I want to take you back to 1946.
Yeah.
Okay. And the church, did they speak German in services?
No, I grew up, basically everyone was German, but they no longer spoke German.
Okay.
But I wasn't too far removed. I don't know when that would have stopped. I have in my research, family research, I happen to have pictures of confirmation classes of that church way back to the 1920s.
Mhm.
And what's funny is I looked at these pictures and well, I can't think of his name right now, but one of the pastors, when I was ordained, became a new minister, was one of the older ministers, and he's the pastor, was the pastor of my church way back.
Oh, really? Yeah.
One I remember was Ted Jordan. He baptized me,
Mhm.
and but there are some others that go back, and I'm sure they didn't speak Germans. My father grew up in a German-speaking home because he lived in the same home as my great-grandfather.
Mhm.
It got kind of tight when my grandfather, who was my great-grandfather's son, obviously got married, and then he had kids, and there was this old log cabin that my great-grandfather built in the 1800s.
Yeah.
And so they were German-speaking, but of course they transitioned into English when the kids went to school.
Sure.
Although my great-grandfather, I don't think spoke clear English at all, probably.
Yeah.
He spoke German. In fact, it was interesting, this is kind of irrelevant, but he never became a US citizen. He maintained, wasn't particularly a German citizen, but he didn't transition into becoming American citizen. You could do that then.
Mhm. My grandfather did the same thing.
Yeah, they had to sign documents that they'd be loyal to the American government, you might say.
Yeah.
Or not be loyal to the German people, especially during World War I.
Right.
That was a big issue.
That was big, and that's where my grandfather comes from. And he never became but he was served for America in World War One.
Yeah.
So the reason I asked is because of the date, so close to World War II, and I know there was a lot of not very popular attitudes towards German-speaking people during that date. That's why
So World War I cured that.
that kind of fixed that. And, and by the time we get around to World War II, it wasn't done. Yeah. So I just wanted to think in terms of how language plays such a role in this, and all these streams coming together. I don't know if I told you, one of the churches I served at Elman, Wisconsin, I saw old pictures, and I wish I'd gotten the date, but at one time they moved the German Methodist church that was outside town into town, the building, set the back door to the other church, which was an English-speaking Methodist church, back door to back door, and the pastor would do a service in German and walk out the back door into the other church, and right away doing it in English.
Yeah.
So language is a big deal.
Yeah, we're not that far removed. I was in Mayville, served the church there in the 1970s, and one of the Lutheran churches still had a German-speaking service, and they had an old retired pastor who did that one. He can't speak German.
Yeah, so the language is important. I mean, how we learn our faith in language plays a real role in how we can be able to figure out what these things mean.
Right, right.
So just looking now with that history in mind, because as you pointed out, we've been a kind of like a river of several streams coming together to form a river. And the United Methodist Church was a big church. It still is, although not as big as we were when you started or I started for sure. But the process now with this dividing current we could look at where we are right now, because the Global Methodist Church has already began back in May. They essentially became a denomination. Announced. That has created a real issue for those churches that have wanted to disaffiliate. In other words, follow this new stream, which is very traditional. And by the way, limits bishops' terms. That's why I was glad you mentioned it, because that's why it's back again. They want a 6-year term, and then when they complete that term, either retire or go back into the church. So anyway, so those things, they never go away, do they?
No, it's interesting.
And but I want to talk about what people are now remarking about what is the central division, what is really causing this, because this very much goes back to the time when you were talking about where the churches came together. What they're saying is, it's how the scriptures are read. So now I want to see if there's a difference between the time you're talking about when the merger took place of the EUB and the Methodist to make the United Methodist, and today. So people are saying is, it's social issues they're talking about. That's what everybody gets arguing about. But when you get down to it, what they're saying, it's how you read the scriptures. So there's one faction that says the scriptures are as were written. We're not able to take our cultural views and alter how we understand scripture. The other side is saying quite the opposite. Scriptures should dictate how we understand the culture and determine our positions on cultural issues. So you see what I'm saying? The difference in biblical interpretation. Now, was that an issue when the merger was coming together? You know, were people saying, well, you don't read the Bible the way I do?
Yeah. And I think that's been an issue. That's been an issue in my mind, within local churches forever, probably.
Oh, sure.
Because you have people who are in different positions, some who listen to a lot of religious radio stations who tend to get a view that's a little more conservative.
Yeah.
And those who are on a different path, and they all live together fine, but you always have the little pressure of one using the Bible to, in a sense, make themselves more righteous sometimes than the other, because, you know, no, I believe the Bible, you don't, obviously.
Right.
Well, that's something, where'd you get that from? You know what I mean? It's how you see that, you know, and often, I mean, I've heard that many times in college. You know, we had that, and seminary a little bit, you know, I had the people who really thought they were more biblical than others, and that becomes an issue. And sometimes there is not enough openness about that, and so it can be a problem. But so that's not a new issue. That's
the point I wanted to make here.
Always been around.
It's always been around, and yet, as you pointed out, we've stayed together for 54 years with that tension in place, not only from the former EUB and its predecessors, and the Methodist side and its predecessors. We managed to still find unity at that time.
Right.
And maintain that unity, at least sort of. I mean, in my time, which is 33 years, I have felt that there were times where we were more tolerant and willing to get along with each other than what I've seen over the last decade or so. And you know, I just wondered about how that, because as you say, we become mature as a church, perhaps. And people over time begin to forget about what brought us together.
Yeah.
See, and that's what you uniquely can speak to, is what one stream of that helped us form the United Methodist Church. What was going on at that time, and all of the, you know, the history that's there is wonderful.
Yeah.
And the Methodist Church has its history, and it was wonderful. Methodist Episcopal before that. And I want people to know that this wasn't an easy thing back in 1968. It just wasn't. It took time to get to that point. It took negotiations, right? And it took some people that weren't so excited about it.
That's right.
At the time.
And I dealt with any of that related to the specific denominations, either the EUB or the Methodist back 54 years ago. That itself is the issue. It's just that it is those kind of spiritual things that haven't gone away. Right. And we're not labeling them now, you know, I'm for EUB, I'm different, but we've forgotten pretty much about that. Yeah. And, you know, the church union really, it was good because it helped people to grow up a little bit and to accept each other. And, except for my home church, which separated. I don't know if I said this on. No,
I don't think you have yet. That's a great story. Tell it quick.
But you know, I was the only one who voted against the merger in Wisconsin, and my home church was the only local church, to the best of my knowledge, that was allowed to separate itself and go its own way. And it's a rural church, a nice church physically. Excuse me. But part of it was, I think the conference did not see a lot of value in the building. They weren't going to make anything off of it. And to go through the effort of selling it and stuff like that would be more difficult than just saying, hey, take your church and run. Yeah. And was interesting. My home church had not paid their apportionments for 2 or 3 years, kind of with this coming up. There were a little bit of a protest.
Oh, sure.
They're not paying the apportionments.
That's happening now, by the way, too. But go ahead.
They didn't want to, you know, do the merger.
Yeah.
And so the annual conference said, well, if you pay your apportionments, catch up, pay everything you owe us, you got the property.
With your assets, you could go.
Yeah. Okay. So you can take it and go. And they've done fine. And it's still out there today, and they've doubled the size of their building. They've added onto it a new sanctuary,
Really?
twice as big as the old one.
Yeah.
And the church has done pretty well.
Now, did they go independent? Did they just?
They went independent.
Did they really?
Yeah.
Okay, because that's.
Hired their own pastor. What's fun, it's a rural church, and 10 miles away there was a farmer who went to Moody Bible Institute.
Mhm.
He became their pastor.
Is that right?
And he had milked his cows during the week and did the church on Sunday. And did a good job and built the church up. It's
Yeah.
amazing. Because he was one of them, you know.
Yeah, sure.
And so it worked out okay. It's had a few ups and downs. It had a little bit of a split, but 6 years or so ago, all my relatives left the church,
Oh,
basically.
See, that's what happens, right?
Yeah.
But you know, that's interesting too, that history about your church, because currently that's the big, you know, thing right now is how does a church disaffiliate? Because in our denomination, the discipline does not make it easy.
Right.
It is a couple of years worth of apportionments. If you go under the 2016, you need to essentially buy your church back. But meantime, all of the assets in the accounts you have go over to the annual conference, of which you and I are both members.
Yeah.
And essentially you have to buy your church back without using your church's money to do it. So it's never been done very well. That's the trust clause.
Yeah.
But in this little window that we're in right now, from 2019 special general conference till December 31st of 2023, there is a little window there where they gave you the ability to disaffiliate, provided you pay this year's and next year's apportionment. You pay a prorated amount that has to do with your and my pension and any pastors that have served, projecting out how many years we should live. That gets calculated somewhere down the way. And that's pretty much it.
Okay.
But that's a small window of opportunity, and there are churches in our state that are taking advantage of it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's interesting. They're providing that.
well, it goes away. It sunsets. And so for any church to actually take advantage of that, they really need to be on in the process by September 1st this year. That's why this is such a timely conversation too. But the question is, how does a church that brought unity together, it's lasted 54 years, how does it graciously allow a church like the one you served when you were in seminary, you know, as a young pastor there, to disaffiliate, to say, no, we cannot continue on with you. Well, it's different all across the country because of a funny loophole. Every state's different. Every conference, I should say,
right.
is different
Yeah.
in how they're handling it right now. So but I have always felt a home in the United Methodist Church because I've always felt there was a tolerance for a very broad view theologically, which is what we're talking about with how you understand and read the scripture, and also a very broad view socially.
Yeah.
We have our social statements, but you have been able to serve most of your career in the United Methodist Church.
Yeah.
I've been able to serve all of my career in the United Methodist Church, and we both knew our positions, and maybe we agreed, maybe we didn't, but we've been able to serve effectively. And it does.
We were talking before, you know, my assignment, my appointment after Door County, when I began here in 65, 1970, I was appointed to two churches. And one was a former Methodist, one a former EUB. And they were very different.
Oh, sure.
And
Something like that too.
so I had a totally different kind of ministry in each church.
Yeah.
But I was able to handle that.
Yeah.
So, you know, I was an EUB on one side of the hill and a Methodist on the other side.
Yeah.
And you know, it was little things like funny little things. I mean, well, not funny maybe, but now in the former Methodist church, they had to have a stewardship campaign every fall. They had to have it. If you didn't have it, nobody would give.
Okay.
So they did a good job.
Yeah.
We had some influential people, I mean, in the community who were in our church, and they would go around. They run a stewardship committee, and they kept in mind. I was a pastor, and they knocked the road with it. They came to check to see what I was going to be giving next year.
Okay.
So fill out my card and said, yeah, I'm in. And so they did this. And on the other side, they had the former EUB church. I noticed after a year or so, they didn't have a stewardship campaign. And so I was they wouldn't have a stewardship committee. So I kind of became the stewardship committee
Mhm.
as a pastor and asked 6 or so influential guys in town. One was the vice president of the John Deere company that had my church and some others, big farmers. And I said, why don't we just do this? You around, I'll give you each, like 10 names and to call these people to see if they, and they did it very faithfully.
Mhm.
And next year came and people said to me, why are we doing that?
Mm.
We give really well, generally anyway, without having to go around and do that stuff.
Yeah.
And the church had a pretty decent financial record. And the fact is, the church probably gave 20% beyond the budget every year anyway.
Sure.
Without asking.
But you felt you had
Without
to do
asking.
it.
They just did it,
Yeah.
And I said, okay, I guess we forget stewardship campaign. We're just making work for nothing. And but it took me a year to figure that out, see.
Yeah.
And but that was the different of temperament of these former EUBs and the Methodists.
Mhm.
The EUBs were willing to pitch it in. Methodists had to
Gotta pull
a little bit. So
Yeah.
I mean, that's not fair to say, maybe.
Well,
but I mean,
no, but I
it's just
think it's
kind of how
accurate.
it worked.
I think it's accurate. Well, that a lot of people don't know. That's why you can go into a bigger city and you might find a United Methodist church here,
Yeah.
and 3 blocks over is another United Methodist
Yeah.
church. Well, one was former EUB and one was former Methodist.
Right.
And those congregations continued over time. So that also, I know there was a difference in understanding of communion. The EUB did not feel that necessarily that monthly communion was necessary. Is that true?
Right, true.
So-
The discipline said you had to serve at least 3-4 times a year,
Mhm.
quarterly.
Yeah.
Basically, that's what we always did. It was quarterly. Communion was quarterly.
Yeah.
I've never had communion every month. I think here in Surgeon Bay, just my method was I did it 12 times a year. I didn't do it every month.
Mhm.
Lent, I could do it 3 times in Lent, maybe to make up a day,
Makes
to make
sense.
up one. Summers, to me, never were good communion months. There were too many visitors. It was chaotic and
Yeah.
stuff, and
Yeah.
so I usually skip summers.
So that's
Make it
actually a very good idea. I would have to bring that back.
So anyway, but just yeah, I just felt it's important.
Sure.
But in my bringing up, communion was not something that was central.
Mhm.
It was something you had to do
Mhm. Oh, okay. So you did it
every
appropriate
quarter.
times.
Whether you wanted it
Holidays?
or not, you had to do it every quarter because that's a discipline.
Did you
thing.
do it on holidays at all?
No.
No, okay, so
No,
just,
no, never, no.
okay, that's good to
So,
know.
anyway, so I found different ways of approaching it, and usually, I think here I did 12 times a year, but in other churches, maybe 6 times a year.
Mhm.
So, there was no mandate to do it.
No, there's not, although they'd like you to do it. In fact, there was a study done it's been years ago now, maybe 8 years ago, where they tried to direct churches to do it every Sunday. And that
Oh,
did
gosh.
not go over. It did not win out.
I-
There's still some who adhere to that concept.
I mean,
but-
Sundays are chaotic enough, just
Yeah.
having worship and special things or baptisms, all things go on without having communion to worry
Yeah,
about.
I agree.
Because it tends then, to me, communion always meant I had a rush,
That's true.
and I didn't like that.
Yeah.
So, if you wanted, you pretty much, if you would just do communion on a Sunday, attend the whole service on that, that'd be enough. But
Mhm.
when you gotta do other things too, it's just doesn't work.
Well, and for churches that focus on communion or mass as
Yeah.
that particular moment, that is the primary purpose of being
Yeah.
together that Sunday. The other is all window dressing. But in our tradition, it's the
Yeah.
preaching that is fundamental
Yeah.
to the worship experience and the singing and praying.
But you see, our tradition says communion is symbolic.
Yes, that's right.
It's not central to the forgiveness of sins. It's symbolic of it.
Right.
So therefore, it removes the necessity of it.
That's correct. It's the other reason why we don't have altars. We have communion tables.
That's exactly right.
And people, and it doesn't, they could have grown up in the Methodist church and oftentimes will refer to up front the altar. But that's because we don't re-sacrifice. So yes, that's exact, or
Right,
do we
that's true,
participate in the sacrifice? Yeah, that's an aspect and that's another reason why the EUB and its forerunners and the Methodist traditions could work together. It was Wesley, and
Yeah.
it was a more common understanding of the
Yeah.
meaning of communion and
Yeah.
and baptism is more
Yeah.
universal. So here's my last question for you. Okay, you said that it worked out pretty well. If you had to go back to that younger Ken, would you have voted for it, knowing what you know
I would
now?
say now, after experiencing it, it really, yeah. It, well, basically, it broadened, I think, the strength of the church, humanly speaking.
Yes.
It brought more people together to give more support. I mean, we talk about like pension funds and insurance and stuff like that. The big issues of the church, the larger you are, the better that works out.
Yeah.
I don't know if the EUB church could have continued. It had, when we merged, we had about 750,000 members.
Mm-hmm.
And I think some ministers or higher ranking people didn't feel we were growing because, again, we were a smaller German denomination,
Mm-hmm.
and we kind of maintained that German base, shall we say, not
Sure.
intentionally, but just it happened.
Sure.
And I think there was fear that the day would come when we were going to lose out, and so jumping in with the Methodists would be a way of getting ourselves more English
Sure.
and broadening it.
Yeah.
But
And global too.
Yeah. So but it's interesting. Now, my wife comes from a Swedish church,
Mm-hmm.
and which is smaller than the former EUB church.
Yeah.
And that denomination continues to
Oh,
run.
it says it's still running.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. There's a
And they
lot
have
of
their
them.
own seminary and college,
Really?
and there's a lot of support. But what's interesting, I don't know if this is indicative of the whole church, but it just happens that the college she graduated from is in Chicago. And it was when she went to school 50 or some years ago, it was very Swedish.
Sure.
Our granddaughter went to the same school and graduated this past year.
Same
my
school,
wife went
really?
to
Okay.
Swedish Covenant School in Chicago.
Okay.
North Park University.
Yeah.
And probably 2/3 of the students are non-Swedish.
Sure. No.
You don't recognize it anymore. It's like there's no Swedish tradition going on much. I mean, they're maintaining it, but it doesn't have you don't feel it or see it as vividly as it did when my wife was in school.
And that brings up a very interesting thing. So when the United Methodist or the Methodist Church merged with the EUB flavor, or you might say traditions, were still very strongly
Yes, they were.
held. And in the discipline, we maintained the EUB's statements separate from the Methodist statement and say we endorse both because they couldn't probably go quite that far. But I wonder today how many people still hold that EUB flavor. Now, I've served churches that were one town Methodist,
Mhm.
Episcopal, actually, one was, the history goes further back. The other was EUB. And I still, my opinion, saw the difference with the two congregations, even though they lived 7 miles apart.
Mhm.
They were of the same kind of backgrounds. They got the same high schools for the most part. And yet I still noticed traditions slightly different in each.
Mhm.
And in the UB church, they were more comfortable with a tradition of scripture reading and preaching, whereas the Methodist church was the one that always wanted to talk more about what was going on in the world.
Okay.
At the current moment.
Okay, yeah.
And I always felt like that was a generational thing that had been passed down. Not that the UB didn't care about those things, because the big issue at the time when the merger took place was civil rights.
Mhm.
And I know that was agreed.
Yeah.
There was a common belief there. But I'm thinking that the people today, that's where I'm going with this, the people today that are most about wanting to tear the church apart, or the two extremes, do not remember the history or have a sense of the history of how we came together. I think they're reacting on the current moment, and they're not as much appreciating why we got to where we are today. And maybe if we were a little more thoughtful about how we came to be here,
Mhm.
maybe we'd be a little more reluctant to just say everything matters that's happening right now, and nothing matters what is past. And I think that's why so many are so quickly saying, "Hey, we don't care about the United Methodist Church anymore.
Mhm.
We're going to go our own way."
Yeah. And, again, I think reflecting upon who we were at United Methodist, we allowed people to kind of go their own direction within the church.
Yeah, within boundaries, but they
Yeah.
were broad.
I mean, you could have two different Bible studies going on and they're both different.
You
That
could.
was okay.
That was okay.
As long as you had a leader for both, and So, things like that, the diversity was, just accepted.
Yes.
And especially we EUBs have accepted diversity, which was greater than Methodist Church and what we had. We were narrower.
Yeah.
So now all of a sudden we got a little bit fatter.
Yeah.
And I mean, even, of course, I was only a pastor for 3 years in the EUB church before the merger.
Yeah.
But we didn't have all of the conference committees, the social concerns and all these different kinds of committees that when we became United Methodist, suddenly we had a myriad of committees.
Yeah.
And I was on 2, 3 of them, conference wise,
Sure.
And it was different in that you say the world concern was more the issue of a lot of the committees. And,
Social Justice Committee and all of that was all present with the Methodist Church.
yeah. So we adopted that or brought that into our tradition to some degree. Yeah, we were more spiritually centered. And I can't think that's not.
Well, I think
spiritually centered, more personal centered, you might say. I think
in relationship
in the church.
Yeah, I think that's
and
true.
a different type of spirituality.
Mhm.
And that was very strong. I mean, when I grew up, we had these big revival meetings.
Yeah.
I mean, we had ministers, preachers coming from all over the country, spend 2 weeks in our church, fill it up every night.
Yep. Which is hard for people to believe now, but that's true.
And it was great, and this was what kind of kept the spirit of the church alive,
It got people charged up a bit. And
yeah.
Ironically, the committee structure you talk about when I started in 1990, of course, they were all still there. We don't have them anymore.
Oh, okay.
It's not required anymore. So now you kind of make up, we've gone to what's called a leadership board by the model in which you essentially put everything under one big committee with a couple maybe small ones doing some stuff. Because we don't have the leaders. But did you have the experience in your time when you had to fill those spots of this is how when I first started we'd do it, and it's just another odd story, but this would have been in a former EUB church. And so what we would do, we'd have all these spots to fill because the conference said we had to, and they just opened the membership guide that they had and say, well, she hasn't done this for a few years, let's put her there, and he hasn't done it, let's get him back. Did you have anything ever like that?
In my time, fortunately, we never really had any leadership crises
so you had
not a problem.
Yeah, okay.
In fact, sometimes almost all people were competing for leadership in the church.
We could do it,
which was interesting. And so I had really good luck, and I had, some really good people in my churches. I shouldn't say good from big in judgment, but high-ranking community people, business leaders,
high interest people. They were high interested in the church.
Correct. Yeah, and they were willing leaders. I was asked. When I was in the Horicon church, which didn't want the stewardship campaign to get plenty of money, they also had new leaders.
Yeah, and
we had every fall we had a planning session. We go to the church Camp Byron then for a Sunday afternoon.
Yeah.
And one year I had Don Ott come and be our leader before he was a bishop. He was a Wisconsin conference.
Yes, retired bishop now. Yeah.
And what was funny is that we probably had 30, 40 people from the church there for this planning meeting. And so some had kids that brought along. So I said, okay, I'll watch the kids. You guys have your meeting.
Nice.
And so they did. And Ott kind of smiled and said, you're the minister. You weren't even in the meeting. No, I take care of their kids. They had a meeting and they decided what they wanted to do. And he took a leadership position and got stuff done.
That's remarkable. Even in the largest churers I know of today, they'd never get 30 people together to make any decision on anything to do with leadership. It just doesn't happen.
And that church brought in, we sponsored a Laotian family, and everybody thought it was the greatest thing in the world. And we had all these different things that they were willing and able to do, and they did it. I just,
well, I think that's good leadership on your part, but that's also what the church is really all about. It's really about, and both of the traditions that you represent is about the cooperation between the clergy and the laity and accomplishing the mission of the church. I think that's been one of our biggest strengths as United Methodist Church. And unfortunately, that's another place we're seeing a split going on today, because the clergy are taking a particular view that is maybe not as on the same sort of political religious level as is the laity. And so what we're finding in right now is a lot of the separation is being driven by the laity. in certain churches.
Yeah,
Not by the clergy, and that's rare that you'll find
Yeah.
that, and I hope it stays rare, because I don't think we should be the push for whatever a church chooses to do in these times. But that's another change
yeah,
that has happened over these years, is the crisis of leadership.
yeah,
You didn't experience, I didn't initially, I mean, because these people didn't say no.
Yeah.
They said, sure, I could do it another round, but
Yeah.
today, people say no.
yeah. I mean, I feel it, the whole world has changed.
Oh,
I mean, our social clubs, that we belong to and all, it's tough for the leaders.
Yeah, very much.
And attendance was falling off,
Yeah.
and it's just like, oh gosh, what's
Everywhere.
going on?
Yeah.
People are finding a different way to live, and so I don't know, we're busy with everything, I guess, and don't have time for some of the things that once were a little more important. And
Yeah.
so it's a changing world, and so I don't know, how the church merges all relate to all of that, but I mean, the world is finding, I think, the same kinds of things.
Oh, absolutely it is. And we're, whether or not we like it, are part of the world.
Yeah,
And we're impacted by the world.
yeah,
And I have hope that we can get by, your history you're talking about, and you show on the diagram there too. And that, of course, mirrors the Christian church in general that's done this since it split back in 1054, the East and West, has been a story of diverging streams coming back together and merging back into big rivers here and there, and and maybe our grandchildren, great grandchildren, maybe they'll see a better day in the church than we're seeing right now. But I think it's really important, though, to know this story that you just told about this, because if we're going to make sense out of where we are, I'm a big believer we have to know where we've been, and if we want to know where we're going, that we need to also not only know where we've been, also where we are now, and trying to plot a future for this church that you serve too. The question is, how do we focus on being the church here in Sturgeon Bay, living together in congregation, letting some of these political divisions and all this sort of stuff that creates division and forms unity. But my goal here is to try to help us stay united as a congregation and weather this storm of whatever's going on. And one of the ways I believe that happens is by hearing the story of how we got to where we are and knowing that we're a part of something pretty big.
Yeah, we're part of something big, right? And I think, we've been talking about, I think probably what we have to do, the core of the church is our own personal spirituality.
Yes.
And I think we as a church have to affirm that in each other. No, it's us, who we are, what we believe, and the things beyond us, the little opinion things, we've got to put those second.
Yes.
Because we're all different, but we need to be united in what we believe, we probably should say the Apostles' Creed every day or whatever, something. This is what we believe.
Something.
Can we all say yes to that?
Yeah.
And if we can, we're gonna be okay.
We're gonna be okay.
That's the thing. Can we, that's the heart of who we are. And so then, if you don't like doing this project here, we'll do a different one. I mean, these mission projects, I've had people come up to me, in our church, we have a monthly mission project. I did this in the former church too in Port Edwards. It was fun.
Yeah.
And they caught on, just like caught on here.
Sure.
People love doing that, but sometimes people come and say, I don't like your project this month. I said, that's okay. You give to something else. Okay.
That's right. There's always next month.
Right. So that you don't have to believe everything, because we had some things were on the edge, and I thought it was good for people to be exposed to what was going on. And I would bring in the speaker for a mission project,
Sure.
would be something different. And they, I don't know if I like that or not. See, well, don't give to it.
That's freedom of choice. Yeah.
But you know about it at least.
That's right. That's right. You know more than you did before. And there will be people that do resonate with that particular mission and say, I'm so glad you brought that one up. I've had that too here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but again, I thought, it was that diversity we're bringing together, different branches. Everything was pretty much faith-based or community help-based. But, sometimes we don't believe what the other guy does, and that's okay.
That's okay.
Just don't make war.
That's right. That's right. So, and a minute ago you said we'll be okay. So, are you optimistic that way? You think we're going to be okay?
Oh, I think, okay, if we believe in Christ as our savior,
Mhm.
that's our unity. If we can hold that, we will hold together. And the other stuff is have to be frivolous. I mean, it's just outside stuff. So if we, believe that we're being faith driven, we have no choice. We'll be together. It'll be automatic.
And
So,
it'll be okay.
what?
And it'll be okay.
It'll be okay.
Okay,
right.
that's a great way to end this conversation. Is
So,
the concept that we're gonna be okay.
Sometimes, sometimes you get fat, sometimes you're skinny, but you keep on going.
You keep on going, and I know we will here.
Yeah,
There's-
I believe in Christianity. I believe in Christ, and I believe we're going forward.
All right. Well, it's been wonderful talking to you about this.
Yeah, well, thank
I
you.
really appreciate it. And like I say, I don't know of anybody else that could give such a unique understanding of that time in history. That ties these churches together that I serve here, you serve, several have over the years, but also speaks to the greater church that is United Methodist Church in ways I don't know of anybody else I could have asked that question of. So I appreciate it very much.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah.
All right.
Hope I've done well.
You've done very well. Thank you, sir.
Okay. Thank
All
you,
right.
David.